Hi everybody, we are now on to step 2, which is exactly the same as step 1, except for the opposite. So instead of doing a very shallow depth of field, we're going to do a very wide depth of field, which means we're going to try and get everything in focus. So let's move on and find some places to do that. You know what? Let's talk about it a little bit more. Remember we had to open our aperture up way wide to get a shallow depth of field. Now we're going to tamp that way down to a fairly high number, at least f8 or f11. And you want to zoom out. So I'm going to be shooting today using a 35mm lens, which is wider than the 50mm. That doesn't mean you guys should shoot at 35. You should probably go more like 20, 24, somewhere around there because of the different kinds of sensors in our cameras and math that I'm not going to get into. But generally you want to stay back a little bit from your subject so that you can get that extra depth of field, zoom out, and tighten your aperture down. And then just adjust your shutter speed and your ISO accordingly to make it all work. So now we're going to walk around Rollins Savannah and see if we can find some places that need more depth of field. I came out here because landscapes tend to be where you want to get everything from the foreground to the middle ground to the background all in focus so you can tell a real story with what's going on. So let's see what we can find. Okay, so here I am and we're going to try our first kind of landscapey shot. And on my camera here, I'm shooting right now at 1/1500th of a second, ISO 100, f1.8. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move my aperture to something that I would consider kind of a landscapey aperture. So f11. That's not as small as it'll go. I can go all the way up to f22. And we can try that in a second and see what the difference is. But let's start with f11. And then I'm going to bring my shutter speed down to something that I can handle, which this lens has a stabilizer on it. So if you have that, turn that on. That'll let you turn your shutter speed down a bit. Right now, looking at my histogram, I am actually okay at f11, 1/60th of a second, ISO 100. I know the assignment says to start at ISO 800, but if you don't need it, don't use it because you'll get extra grain. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for something. I want to get kind of this matted down grass where the deer slept, and then also the purple stuff. Purple, those are called flowers, yeah, purple flowers. And then maybe that tree in the background. So let's see if I can get all that kind of in focus. So I'm going to set my focus point somewhere not very in the front, kind of in the middle third there. So I'm focusing right on the edge where the purple grass becomes the flowers. And then I'm actually going to tilt it up and down so I get more of that foreground. And then let's see what my shot looks like. That's pretty good focus. If I want to increase my depth of field, I can let's go that up to f16. Let's go all the way to 22. And then I'm just going to drop my shutter speed until I get that histogram right in the middle, right about there, 1/10 of a second. And I'm not even going to bother to refocus because the focus point should work the same. And that one came out okay too. Maybe I go vertical. We'll get even a little bit more of that foreground sense. Cool. The reason why I focus a little ways into the picture is because your focal point is going to have a lot behind where you focus, like farther in the distance, but also some in front of where you focused. So when you're trying to get maximum depth of field, you go about 1/3 of the way into the distance and find a focal point somewhere in there. To me, that was somewhere right on the edge of the grass, and that way I'm going to get everything behind it in focus until I run out of focus, range, and then a bit in front of it as well. So hopefully I'll get the whole frame in focus. That's called looking for the hyperfocal point, where you get the maximum amount of sharpness in the picture. I don't do it in a very mathematical way. Some people really like to geek out about the numbers. I just figure a little ways into the frame so that it's not too bad. That's what I do. Okay, so now this one is kind of a classic kind of shot that you might want to do for some landscapey stuff because we've got these long leading lines going right down through this boardwalk, and that's kind of a cool photographic element. So I'm going to see what kind of shot I can get there. So looking at my camera, let's start it recording. Right now my exposure is about the same as it was because the light hasn't changed much. It's actually a little bit brighter because it's about 8:15 in the morning and the sun is slowly coming up. So I've increased my shutter speed to 1/15th of a second. I'm going to go right down, smack down the middle of this, and then focus right about there. And try and level my horizon and fire off a shot. That's pretty good. Let's try a vertical. And as I said yesterday, when we're shooting like multiple versions of the same basic picture, those don't count as different pictures, right? Oh, that's kind of cool too. And maybe I'll do this one pointing down more. I'm trying to do it without getting my shadow in the shot. Something like that. And then one like that. And maybe, let me get in a little bit closer and get lower. See what that does. That's going to accentuate the actual boardwalk coming in, makes the perspective look bigger. And we're going to start losing a little bit of focus right in the very foreground there. But not too much. At f22, that's basically coming in. And I'm still looking at my own shadow and hoping it doesn't wreck everything. I'm going to set my focus point more towards the middle just to keep, it keeps throwing me off. I keep thinking, is that in the middle or not? Nobody will see that in the final picture, but yeah. So that looks pretty good. I think when I'm looking for something that I need to shoot in a wide depth of field, I'm looking for a place where it's three-dimensional, right? Like there's a long, you can see the picture goes in. So you look for these kind of parts where you've got like straight lines where the lines start to converge in the distance. Or you look for a cool path that's got like an S-curve kind of thing going on. So we're gonna keep going this way because it gets more fun. So I want to remind you, each time I'm taking a new scene, I shoot 3 or 4 or 5 different versions of that. And those aren't 4 or 5 different pictures in my mind. They're different versions of one picture, and I pick the one that's best. So even though I shot 4 pictures right over there as I was coming onto the boardwalk, I wouldn't turn in all 4 of those and be like, you tell me which one is best. It's your job as the student to decide which one is your best shot and give me that version. So now this might not come out that good. I kind of couldn't help it because there's an egret over there and a great blue heron over there. I don't have a long lens, so I probably won't be able to get them. But we're gonna try and shoot and see what we can do. So I'm already recording there, that's good. And let's just check my exposure. Exposure looks good. What I'm gonna see if I can do is use some of this pond scum to make sort of an interesting element there. So like have that lead us through. And I'm trying to pay attention to my horizon line to make sure that that's fairly level. Because there's nothing like a tilted horizon, like slightly tilted, to make you look really unprofessional and like you don't know what you're doing. And then this one, I'm just gonna make it a little bit more of a conventional kind of, we'll bring the sky into a little bit more. We'll speed up that shutter to drop down that exposure so that the sky's not blown out. 1/20th of a second, f22. The light meter at the bottom says I'm underexposed a little bit, but I think I'll be okay. And then I just accidentally hit the focus button. Let's try that. Yeah, I don't really like those pictures. It's not very well balanced because the trees and stuff. So we're gonna keep moving. I probably wouldn't even turn those ones in. But you never know until you shoot it. So generally, if I see something that I think maybe that's cool, shoot it now. You can always come back and shoot it later. Like I could come back tomorrow morning with a telephoto lens and try and get some of these guys because they'll be back. They're here like every day. Okay, let's keep moving. This one's pretty cool just because I like the way that the shadows kind of lead into the frame. And then there's all these big yellow flowers and the bench there in the distance. I feel like I might be able to get a decent shot with that. So let's see what we can get here. So looking at that, light meter says I'm overexposed, which is surprising, but my histogram says I'm just fine. So I'm gonna trust the histogram, and I'm gonna try and make those flowers look as big as possible. So I'm gonna raise the camera up and then tilt it down a bit so that they're kind of like near the top of the frame, and then maybe take a step forward, get a little bit less of that shadow in here. And I think that's a fairly decent shot. It doesn't, I'm not gonna win awards with it, but right now we're playing with the concept of what you would wanna do. So this is the shot that I was kind of waiting for because I was just thinking this would be the best one. It's got the most interesting light going in here, kind of the dappled shadows, and we've got this like crooked kind of boardwalk going through, so it's more interesting shapes to deal with. So let's see what we can get for a picture here. It's also gonna mean we're gonna change our exposure the most of any of the pictures that we've done because it's darker. Right now it's saying I'm 3 stops underexposed. So I'm gonna boost my ISO because I don't really want to change my shutter speed any more than I have to. I want to keep those dark shadows, but I don't want to lose any of my highlight kind of information. So I'm gonna go over this way and maybe raise it up. see what that looks like. That's kind of cool. And I didn't even notice when I was first looking at this branch, big thick branch that's going, but it's highlighted by some of the sunlight. So I might bring that into the picture a little bit more. Let's try that again. I can't exactly see what I'm doing there, so I have to keep reviewing. Normally I'd be shooting mostly through the viewfinder, but that gets turned off when you're using one of these Atomos recorders. Let's try like that. That shows me a little bit more of the boardwalk as it goes in through a distance. We can try a vertical, see what that does. And get right in the middle there. Focus maybe on that leaf. That should give us enough depth of field to really work with. Now, depending on the camera that you're using, you may get more or less depth of field with the aperture that you have. The Canon power shoots, those probably have the most depth of field. What they're going to really struggle with is the previous exercise where people are trying to get a shallow depth of field and really blur out the background. A cell phone, if you see portrait mode on an iPhone or whatever the equivalent is on Android, that's using software to blur out the background because cell phones have such a hard time blurring anything out. That really boils down to the size of the sensor in the camera. The larger the sensor, the shallower your depth of field is going to be, which is great for portraits, maybe not as good for landscapes. So with an iPhone, if you go, you're going to get, like, everything's going to be in focus from front to back, as long as you don't force it to not do that. With the T6s that most of my students have, you're going to be somewhere in the middle. But f/22, you're probably going to get everything in focus. Technically, f/8, f/11 tend to be a little bit sharper because of something called diffraction, which we're not going to get into. For the most part, I'd rather have everything in focus and not have to do fancy computer stuff to like focus stack it and sacrifice 5% of sharpness, which I can just mostly bring back to the eye by sharpening it on the computer. Nerds will freak out and say I'm blaspheming right here, but who cares? Most of the time, the people looking at your pictures are not nerds. They're just like, that's cool. I like that shot. That's what we're shooting for. All right, I think we have our shots. So just like the last one, slap them into the Google slideshow that you were given. Make sure you put the settings at the bottom and turn it in. Cool. I look forward to seeing what you come up with.